Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to UK Crime Book Club. I'm delighted to be joined by Denise Beddows this evening. And Denise is going to be talking about her array of books that she's written. And the one that you've got out most recently is I'm going to probably say it really badly, but the Nevsky Prospect Affair. Is that right?
Spot on.
So you've written a whole array of books, non-fiction, fiction, and this series that you're writing now is espionage thrillers.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah.
Essentially, it's MI5's counter-espionage team and their adventures and challenges.
So would you like to introduce yourself and your books to us?
Thank you very much, Karen. Well, thanks for inviting me on. And yes, I'm Denise Beddows, and I took early retirement for a career in government service, which took me overseas a fair old bit in some quite far-flung countries. So I took early retirement so that I would be able to write and do something completely different. And obviously, if you've been to a lot of places and you've had one or two adventures, it's very nice to be able to incorporate them, which is what I tried to do. So I started, because at heart I'm a researcher and investigator, and I was also an intelligence analyst. So I like to always have something to research. In fact, my husband says if I don't have anything to research, I start to get twitchy. So any cold cases that need investigating, anything like that, because I love doing true crime as well. But I kicked off by joining my local history and heritage group, and I became their volunteer researcher, and I published several books on local history, and they sell constantly and well, which is good fun. But then I started writing some narrative non-fiction, and then I moved on to crime/espionage fiction, as well as the true crime. And my most recent books, I suppose, unfortunately, with my current one, I don't yet have a copy to show. You can probably see behind me the previous one, which is the Kohat Connection. And thanks to the vagaries of Amazon, although my Kindle version of the Nevsky Prospect Affair, with possibly back to front, I'm not sure how you're saying it. It's been out in Kindle for a while, but we still haven't got a date. It should have been out in July as a paperback, but we'll see how that fares. But I started basing my espionage adventures in the UK because, after all, it was MI5. But then I decided to spread out a bit and take the action overseas. So one of my books was Shearwater Point. That was set in Northern Ireland. And it's where one of my MI5 characters comes from. It's where half my family's from as well. So there was no great struggle in researching that. And there's just so much going on over there, even nowadays, even since peace broke out, as they say. So, and I wanted to combine it with ideas of things that I've been researching myself. So for a long time, I was investigating lots of cases of identity theft, which is extraordinarily common. And I have a story where an American lawyer, a Boston lawyer, big shot, discovers he's adopted and goes back to Northern Ireland to try and find his birth parents. And he's immediately arrested for murder. So that kind of came out of some of my own investigations and experiences. Then I'd spent a few years living in Pakistan, which was absolutely the most wonderful place. And it was pre-Taliban, of course, but it was when the Russians were in Afghanistan, so there's quite a lot going on. But one of my sort of unusual skill sets is I train people in facial recognition techniques. And I used to travel all around the world as a document consultant, training passport check-in, airline check-in agents, that kind of thing. And when I was in Pakistan, on quite a few occasions, the consular staff there asked me if I would pop along to the local morgue and help them to identify a few dead people. And it sounds really gruesome, and it was, but essentially when a British person dies overseas, it's the responsibility of the consular staff to tell their family. And of course, the most important thing you must do is ensure you've got the right person. Just because someone who's jumped out of a helicopter and the parachute didn't open, just because they've got Joe Bloggs' passport in their pocket, it doesn't necessarily mean he's Joe Bloggs. So I used to have to go and, use the facial recognition techniques wherever possible. But when you see some of the chaotic conditions in some of these morgues and what have you overseas, it occurred to me that I wondered how they ever got the right body in the right coffin to the right family. And so that gave me the basis of the Kohat connection, which is
Yeah.
set in Pakistan. And in that particular story, it's a classic Cheshire housewife, 50-year-old Laura Roberts, and her husband does regular business trips to Pakistan in his capacity as a buyer for a tobacco company. And she gets a message to say he's had a heart attack and died out there. And she has to go through horrendous hoops, if you haven't done it, it's awful. The bureaucracy involved in repatriating a body from overseas, and the further away, the more tricky it is. And so she goes along to her local undertakers to see the body that she's brought back in the nice, expensive coffin she's bought. And it's not her husband, Keith. Moreover, it's a young man who's a shooting victim. And so she tries for the next couple of weeks to try and get her husband's company to tell her what's happening. And is Keith still alive? Is he really dead? What's gone on? And nobody seems to be doing very much. So she decides she'll go out to Pakistan and find out for herself. And unfortunately, Kohat, the area she has to go through to, there's quite a lot of Pakistani Taliban activity out there. So she pretty soon gets herself in a bit of trouble. So I drew on a lot of my own knowledge of living out in Pakistan and traveling and going up the Khyber Pass and all of those incredible places. And then when I wanted to write the next one, I thought I'd draw on my experiences again. And the Nevsky Prospect affair is set in Moscow. And actually, I haven't been there, but quite a lot of my colleagues have. So I was able to draw on their knowledge. But the story with that basically is I've met so many people. I've worked with so many people who work for the Foreign Office over a great many years. I've made some very, very good friends. And one particular lady was a very classic Foreign Office secretary. She's no longer with us, sadly, but I think I was 20 and she was 50, and we served in the same post together. And everything about her struck me. She was very self-contained. She would pick up her life and move along every 3 years to a different part of the world. And she would see the best in everything. She would embrace theatrical doings. She would join the local Amdram. She would go to ballets. She was a bit of a culture vulture. But she never married because it's a bit difficult when you're a woman working in a diplomatic job, because you don't tend to meet many men. And if you do, your career ends up being subservient to them. So she arrives in Moscow on her first posting and she absolutely hates it. It's terrible. Her boss is cold. He takes advantage of her good nature. And she soon discovers he has a very shabby little secret. But at the same time, some very, very sensitive information is being leaked from the embassy. And that's as far probably as I ought to say about the story.
Yeah.
But it's a case of somebody sleeping with the enemy, but who is it?
Yeah, I think you could definitely sort of see the research aspect in your books as well. That you really go into the detail, and I really liked when I sort of met Verona, and so she's the secretary, isn't she? And
She is.
And as you said about her, like picking up her life and taking it around with her, she's very sort of particular, isn't she, about what she's got in her drawer and all that sort of thing. So it must be fascinating having, coming from a career like that, to be able to sort of draw that into your books, because they always say, don't they, write what you know. So you've got a lot of knowledge to put into those books. Have you found that sort of made it easier or more difficult to write because you do know the background?
Well, it made it a lot easier, really. And as you know, and I'm sure some of the people you've interviewed have said as well, it's quite annoying when you've written something you weren't quite sure of and somebody picks you up on it. And it's usually something quite inconsequential. I think it was my second book, which I really loved. It was When the Grey Wolf Sings, my second thriller. And it was about a KGB man living in London, long retired, because the KGB have long retired as well, really.
Yeah.
But his best friend is blown up in a car bomb, and he goes to try and get revenge for his friend's death. And in my book, I have him leaping onto a bus somewhere like, is it Hammersmith, and annoying the driver by producing a £10 note. So one of my former work colleagues sent me an email and said, Denise, when was the last time you were on a London bus? You can't pay with a £10 note. You've got to have an Oyster card. And I thought,
oh yeah, you've got to tap one off.
so, I mean, last time I was on a London bus was 1975, I realised.
So your books are they are sort of set now, aren't they? Or the one recently, this one that you've just read is set in the current sort of contemporary time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So is that a challenge when you're sort of, right, like you said there, where you're like having to keep, because everything I imagine has changed or changes so often in that sort of environment as well.
It changes very rapidly. In fact, the first book I wrote during lockdown because there wasn't a lot else to do.
No.
And in fact, it described how the challenges of investigating and tracking someone down, finding out who this awful sort of potentially terrorist is, when there's a lockdown scenario, and you can't go and sit in a cafe and have a cup of coffee unless you had a sausage roll with it. Apparently,
yeah,
remember that.
I do remember that. Yeah,
it was so silly, but it's really funny because a lot of things I've written about that I kind of made up, things that could have happened. They've either come true and people have said, goodness me, you predicted that, or it's things that happen very differently, and they've said, oh, you got that wrong, didn't you?
Yeah.
So that's the trouble with writing contemporary. If you write back in the 1960s, Cold War or something, you can write basically on exactly what happened. But if you're writing in the present, and if Putin doesn't get shot or assassinated, or if the splinter that went into Trump's ear actually went into his eye, if that doesn't happen, then your story's gone out the window. But it's still a challenge. And I also a lot of my research is based on what I read in the news, what's happening now. And you'll see a little snippet like that the UK is building a cyber warfare centre, and you think, well, I wonder where that is, and you do a bit more digging and you find out where it is, and you think, well, that's got to go in the book because that's interesting.
Yeah. So you from the sound of your sort of research and things, you really go into detail and sort of want to. Do you find that can be a challenge sometimes? Is sort of like getting out of the rabbit hole.
Yes, yeah, and it's funny because even if you know something really well and you've not particularly had to research it, it's still worth looking it up, because either you might be describing a building that's been knocked down now and somebody will be sure.
Oh, yeah.
Or in my case, Shearwater Point is obviously set partly in Belfast, which is a city I love and I visit often. I have great cousins there. I think I know it like the back of my hand. And I'm describing the City Hall, which is built of beautiful gleaming white Portland stone. And I have the sun glinting off the beautiful white dome at the top. So somebody reviewed my book on Shearwater Point and said the author's obviously never been to Belfast. She didn't realise that the top of that Portland stone dome is covered in copper because it's green, it's weathered copper. And I thought, oh, yes, I'd forgotten.
So, people are quite handy to point out. They're more than happy to point out their things that and even when you go into really sort of historic, if you sort of include something that's not real because nobody knows whether it was real or not, people will still question whether I mean, the thing is, that is fiction, isn't it? I mean, you write non-fiction as well, so I guess that's that is what it is. But whereas when you're writing fiction, you feel like, well, I feel like you should be able to have that sort of license to make the truth what it is.
It's interesting because recently at a festival, I asked the writer Marnie Riches, I said, where do you get your ideas from and how much research goes into it? And she said, research? She said, I just make things up. Make stuff up, she said, make it up. And I thought, yeah, maybe I should do more of that and not try to be too, accurate. But even with your nonfiction, people try to pull you up because one of the first books I wrote was actually about it was not a narrative nonfiction. It was about somebody in my family tree who was actually hanged for murder, a murder that he didn't commit, but he was hanged anyway. And I described in detail. I'd taken him through his life and his military service, which was in the, forget this right, he was in the East Surrey Regiment. And he was in India. And it was amazing because he'd visited a lot of places in India that I knew quite well. So I was able to describe all of that. And I thought this will please anyone who's familiar with this particular place. And then some chap wrote in and said, "Oh, you've got the West Surrey Regiment serving in India, and they were never there." I said, "Well, I haven't mentioned the West Surrey Regiment; it's the East Surrey Regiment. What can you do?" But you're going to got 3 stars for that one, you know.
Yeah, I know. You just can't. You can't please all the people all the time, can't you? That's what they say.
It's true.
So when you sort of start, writing your books and getting your ideas, how do you are you a plotter? Do you sort of plot out? Are you sort of quite meticulous, or are you more of a sort of, by the seat of your pants sort of thing?
I have to say I'm largely a pantser, not a plotter. So I always know how, I say this so often, and it's true. I know how the story is going to kick off, and I know usually how it's going to end. The difficult bit is that bit in the middle, so otherwise it's fine. But it's, I don't sort of have writer's block, but I do often come to a crossroads, and I think the story could go one of 3 ways. And so I like to go and sleep on that and think about it. And then usually I wake up in the morning and those sort of fairies in your head have worked it all out for you. And I have to quickly get downstairs and get on the old keyboard, cup of tea, and I'm away. But, I do admire people. There are people who will plot out the whole thing. They have a chapter outline for every chapter. And I have tried doing that, but I very rarely stick to the script. I'll go completely off piste. Because something suddenly occurs to me, I'll catch sight of a news item or something. Or I was fascinated looking at Putin's doubles. He's got at least 3 doubles, and I've been doing the facial recognition on them, and like the ears are in different places. And ears don't move. I can say that with some authority. But with whenever you see Putin, his ears are in different positions on his head.
And his jawline. That's really interesting.
Yeah. So that fascinates me. So I thought I've got to get that in some way.
So, I mean, going from that sort of job that you had where, you're all over the world, and what sort of inspired you to sort of, want to write? Was that always something that you wanted to do from sort of day one, really?
Well, my father was an avid reader. He was passionate about books, and he actually taught me to read. As soon as I could stand up at his knee, he had me learning my letters. And I used to be so envious. He'd take me down we had a mobile library in our neighbourhood. And he used to take me down there every Thursday night. And he came out with books, and they just gave them to him to take home, and it was marvellous. Didn't have to pay for them or anything. And I said, "Well, I want some books." And he said, "Oh, you're too young." So I think I had a hissy fit. And so the next Thursday, we went back, and he said, "All right, tonight you're going to get books." But he said, the trouble was, to join our library, you had to be 7 back then, and I was only 5. So he said, "Now look, Pet, when we go in, don't forget, stand on your tiptoe. And if anyone asks your age, you tell them you're 7. So I thought, well, that's a bit odd, but okay. So I went in, and I'm hanging on the counter on my tiptoes. And the library assistant didn't look fooled. And she said, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'm 7. My dad says I'm 7. So she said, "No, there's no way she's 7. She's not having any books." And suddenly all the people in the library, all the grown-ups came around and created quite a fuss. They give the kid her tickets. What you do? It was mean. So I got my tickets, but the children's section was up. There was a shallow end of the bus that went over the towing vehicle, and that was the kiddie section. And it had these 3 big steps, so my dad had to lift me up. It was too small to get up into the kids section. But I came out with my books, so, that was all that mattered.
That was how it all began.
It was. And then my dad used to say, "Write me little stories." And what we didn't have, we weren't very well off, to be honest. So we couldn't go out and buy lots of notebooks and pens and things like that. So he would take wallpaper offcuts and cut them up into equal sized pieces, and he would stitch them together to make a little book. And he'd say, "Now take that away. Here's a stub of a pencil and write me a story." So that was the start of my writing career. No life experience to include in it, but I used to write about the neighbour's dog and things like that. So I thought, this is easy. I could do this.
Yeah. So how did you get into your profession? How did you get into that sort of, the facial recognition and all that sort of thing? How did that sort of come about?
Well, I joined the what used to be, it doesn't exist anymore as in the same format. I joined the UK Immigration Service, which was part of the Home Office.
Mhm.
So I became, eventually a document, a travel and identity document expert. And I got involved in all areas of immigration work, whether it was immigration enforcement or training other immigration staff, forgery detection. I reckon I could actually forge documents myself if I had to. Not that I do have to, but a bit of everything. I even did court work. I worked as a presenting officer in immigration appeals, and both at the appellate level and also at the tribunal up in the Strand,
Yeah.
and that was great fun. You pick up a lot of skills there. You get a knowledge
Mm,
about the rules of evidence and disclosure issues and that sort of thing. So that comes in handy every now and again when you're writing anything crime
yeah.
based. And then of course there was always lots of opportunities to work overseas, and I did visa work and this airline consultancy kind of work where they sent chief immigration officers like me overseas to train airline staff in how to check passports properly and how to make sure the face went with the photograph, because quite often it doesn't. So that was great fun, really. And
Yeah.
we obviously have our own intelligence effort, and we really benefited from that in 1998 when sort of peace broke out in Northern Ireland, and various intelligence agencies lost a lot of their work.
Mm,
So they were able to look around for new things to occupy them, and illegal migration, people trafficking, people smuggling, that became an important part because organised crime had really moved into that.
yeah.
So I got heavily involved in that and trained as an intelligence analyst. And so that's kind of useful as well in my books. And I try to have cross-border crime involved in it as well.
Yeah. I mean, you've got so much, a wealth of knowledge. So have you, do you think that the sort of with your writing, obviously with the different genres, have you got a favorite that you've written, the espionage or the non or the, the true
Mm.
crime or the non-fiction?
Well, I veer towards true crime, largely because I love the challenge where someone says, "Oh, there was a murder down the road 15 years ago, and it never got solved." And I think, "Oh, let me have a look." Let me have a look. And I'm into family history research. I do an awful
Hmm.
lot of that as well.
Yeah.
But with the true crime, you mix with an awful lot of different people. I love going to things like Crime Con. I'm going to next month, and that's lots and lots of retired police officers who are now writing books, and some fantastic books. And I had the great pleasure actually in back in April of going to the True Crime Awards because one of my true crime books was shortlisted for their Book of the Year award, and it came second. I got a highly commended. But it was just the most fantastic afternoon and evening
Mm,
because I was with some of my true crime heroes, people like Jackie Moulton and Joe Millington and Colin Sutton and all these big names. And I can't remember half the people I met, but it was Alice Vinton, and all of that was really nice. And it's uh, it's strange because with doing the family history research, I actually discovered at least four murders in my family back in, historically.
wow.
And so obviously that's something you've got to get into having a look at and investigating.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I think the worst of them really was my book, The Forgotten 44, my true crime book, is based on there have been several books about this America's what essentially was America's first serial sex killer, and he was a guy called Earl Leonard Nelson, and he was quite an unpleasant psychopath, and he was, I suppose, credited is the wrong word, but the 22 deaths were laid at his door,
Mm,
22 murders. He went all across America from coast to coast, murdering women in every city and girls, and even one 8-month-old baby. I mean, he was a really psychopathic man.
mm,
But when he worked his way up into Canada, he murdered a teenage girl there, and then he murdered a lady named Emily Patterson, and she was his last victim. And she was the only murder victim, only one of his victims for whom he was convicted and hanged. And she was my ancestor. So she was one of my murdered ancestors. So when I started reading some of the books, a couple of books
Mm.
people had written about Nelson, I was quite horrified how all the facts were wrong. They'd misnamed the victims, they'd miscounted them. My Emily was a beautiful young woman of 27, and she had two small boys. And I think one author described her as an elderly lady who reminded him of his strict grandmother. So it couldn't be further from accurate. And the other thing I found in researching was, although they established 22 murders were laid at his door, I've counted at least twice that number of women and girls that were attacked by him. Some survived, not all did. So I started looking into them and found that, it made me very angry that they'd been misnamed. I mean,
Mm.
one of his victims was British. She was a war heroine from World War One. She'd been in the Women's Army Corps, and she'd been wounded at Vimy Ridge, and she'd gone over to America for a holiday and to recuperate. She'd married and had a child there, and she was murdered by this Earl Nelson, and her name was Maureen Oswald. But in one of the books about the killer, she's named as Mrs. Antwerp, and how you get from Maureen Oswald to Mrs. Antwerp.
Yeah.
And, she was completely written off as a nobody. And so I wanted to put all these victims at centre stage. And,
Mm.
they've even got Earl Nelson misidentified. They say he was half English, half Spanish, but he wasn't. His ethnicity is a bit different. So I wanted to, right all those wrongs
Yeah.
and misapprehensions.
And because I think you're obviously sort of meticulous with your research, I think it's really important, particularly when you're writing true crime or non-fiction, is to get those people right. Because obviously in your instance, Sarah's saying on the chat that she's done some family history, but this really tore at her heart. She said, finding out those things about your own family must be truly awful. But
Mm.
actually making sure that they're sort of reflected accurately is also important for all the victims, isn't it? So
It is, and I think it's nice to put people in their proper context.
yeah.
Some of an awful lot of the victims in this particular case were written off as hysterical. That nobody believed them, and
No.
we had some really bad U.S. medical examiners who were very loath to decide that something was a murder, and there were at least two of the victims were found locked in a trunk, one strangled, and that one went down as a suicide. I mean, how you can lock yourself from the outside in a trunk and strangle
Yeah.
yourself? And
That
another
sounds.
well, another woman was stuffed behind a hot boiler, so her leg was badly burnt, and they said, oh, she'd had a heart attack and dived behind a boiler. I mean, so there's a lot of that, a lot of police incompetence and a lot
Mm.
of medical examiner incompetence. But and maybe you could put that down to the times. It was 1920s, but at the
Yeah.
same time, I just felt these ladies. It's a bit like Hallie Rubenhold's book about the five, the victims of
Oh
Jack the
yeah.
Ripper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and she wanted to put them as the main.
Mm.
Never mind Jack the Ripper; he can come later in the book. But these
Yeah.
victims, these are the important people, and so
Yeah.
that's what I wanted to do because one of them was my ancestor. So it meant something to me.
Definitely. Yeah, I can see why. In sort of complete sort of contrast to that, when you're writing sort of your fiction, is that sort of freedom to be able to, make things up, make it, particularly with sort of thrillers and espionage, to be able to sort of take it a little bit further than what would be, maybe real. Is that quite freeing as an author when you're sort of, able to sort of do what you like, really?
It really is actually, Karen. It's as long as you keep it credible, I think you
Yeah.
can make anything up. I mean, I think from my early books, Vladimir Putin would probably be dead by now if what I'd written about him was true, but he's still going. So you have to be prepared for any eventuality. But you can stretch the boundaries, I think, because it's fiction.
Yeah.
As long as it is credible, you don't. And one of the things I keep coming across, I know this is an old-fashioned phrase, but this idea about what they call the hand of God, where somebody has written a story and they get to the end and they don't know how to finish it, and they bring in something completely
Oh
unlikely, a
yeah.
character that you've never met before. I mean, The Wizard of Oz is a perfect example everyone looks at, where Dorothy thinking, how the heck are we going to get home to Kansas? and this witch appears on a broomstick, someone no one's ever met before, and says, "Do you want a lift?" And that's it, you know. And you think, well, that was a cop out, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And I keep coming across things like that and thinking, you know, they need to have a more credible sort of idea, certainly more credible ending, feasible. But
Yes,
yeah,
that's
it's
sort of
disappointing.
it's about having sort of the realism, but having the exciting stuff as well. You want to be able to
Yeah.
have that, particularly in a thriller, don't you? You want to have, and particularly when it's sort of, you know, you're looking at sort of situations that people, because obviously all reading, you know, generally reading is escapism of some form. So you want that sort of excitement built in as well, you know, as a reader, don't you? So sort of, is it difficult to sort of weave that in as well?
It can be. I mean, I'm lucky, really. My husband tends to do my first edit before it gets anywhere near the editor and the publisher. But he always says, "Don't put anything in that couldn't possibly have happened," and he hates anything supernatural. So he says, "Don't see anyone hearing voices or having dreams that then come true. Nothing like that." He said, "You know, it's got to be kept real, but entertaining at the same time." So
Yeah.
yeah, he keeps my feet on the ground in that way.
Um, Sarah's asking who your, I was going to ask you as well, who your favorite author is. Do you have a favorite author you're in sort of inspired by?
It's Michael McClaverty is somebody I really like. He doesn't write anything like mine. He's no longer around, but he's a Northern Irish writer. And whenever I'm feeling a bit low about something I'm writing, I'll just go away and read one of his short stories or one of his books, because his prose is absolutely beautiful. And I think I mean, when you're writing a thriller, there isn't a great scope for putting in, you know, really beautiful prose and descriptive narratives about scenery.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there needs to be a little bit of that in there to set the scene for people. And with Sheerwater Point, I wanted people to be there and see this incredibly beautiful County Down coast with shearwaters, you know, scything through the water and coming up with the fish and all that, and the cloudless skies. I did want it to be Belfast being Rain City, as it's known. Um, so I think he's quite an inspiration. I don't tend to read an awful lot of thrillers, to be honest, because I have this fear that I'll read something and I'll go away and subconsciously write it. And
Yeah.
in fact, I came very close to that because I think it's in my first thriller, The Hunt for Wotak. I have I can't remember how I put it in now, but there's the part of the story is about a GCHQ man who's paid to listen into people's calls, and he's listening into some visiting government ministers from other countries, and he starts to hear lots of secrets, and over time he starts to blackmail people. And so when eventually someone's talking to him about it, they say, "Well, how did you know which of these foreign, you know, finance ministers and all were actually sleeping with their secretaries? How did you know who to bug?" And he basically said, "Well, I bugged everybody. You know, I get to hear them all." And a friend of mine, a writer friend, Cecilia, she said to me, "That's straight out of Day of the Jackal, do you realise?" And I suddenly remembered it was that where they catch the secrets have been given out by a French politician who's sleeping with the secretary. And when the police officer is sitting there and he says, "We heard you," you know, and he goes off to shoot himself. And the other French cabinet ministers sitting around the table say, "How did you know to bug him?" And he said, "I didn't, I bugged all of you." And I thought that was obviously in my head, and I subconsciously,
Yeah.
you know, and it's just too easy, isn't it, really?
I guess that's really difficult though, because some people really like, some people are exactly like you, is they don't read crime, or if they're writing a crime book, they don't read crime at that time, or if they're writing romance, they don't read romance at that time. But some people are just like, well, I just read what I want whenever. So I guess there's stuff in your head that you can, that's been gathering there for years. You know, you remember things like you were saying about, you know, what people remember. Sometimes you remember it in your head very differently to what it was because of the situation you were in or something. So yeah,
Yeah,
it's really difficult, isn't it? It's a challenge. And I think they say, don't they, that there's only something like 7 stories or something, so everybody puts their own spin on it. So yeah,
yes.
it's
I think, was it Chekhov or someone thought there were only 2? He said it was a man goes on a journey or a stranger comes to town. I thought, well, life would be really boring if that's all you had to read. But it's true. I mean, once you've done revenge as a theme, or you know, there are only a limited number of things. But I
yeah.
think um, I recently read, I actually bought an author's book and I was reading it, and I suddenly was very disappointed. I thought, I must have bought this before, I've read it. And I looked at the date of publication and it was very, very recent. So I thought, that can't be right. And so I went hunting around my bookshelves and I found an identical story. And this was a complete rip-off of somebody else's book. And I thought, I felt really cheated. And I thought, maybe could they have done the whole thing, subconsciously, or did they actually think that's a great book, I'll write it myself. So
Yeah,
it is hard. But I think if you can sort of put your hand on your heart and say, well, I don't read an awful lot of espionage, I just like to write it. And as you say, there's things in my head gathering dust that I can bring out and dust off and put in the
yeah.
book. And hopefully what I'm writing will be something a bit different and people won't have read it before. But it's
Well, I
tricky.
think that was, yeah, I was gonna ask you about sort of with espionage. Is there something? Is there sort of things that you think should always be in a good espionage thriller, or are there things that you think should definitely not be, and you read them and think that really wouldn't be in there? When you be the critic.
Well, I have to say that I don't like James Bond type movies. Everyone will be screaming and jumping up and down now. But it was interesting when you were talking to your legal panel recently, and
Oh
was
yeah,
it Imran Mahmood said he doesn't write sex in his books, and I don't really
no,
either, because I think people like James Bond, a real sort of MI6 man, wouldn't have time for all that. And it wouldn't be wise to spend time engaging in dalliances when you're supposed to be keeping a low profile and gathering intelligence. And, if you're following somebody, sleeping with them isn't a good idea. But that seems to be a lot of what James Bond does is seduction. But
yeah,
a bit like Imran was saying, firstly, your family read it, and you don't particularly want them to be reading the sex scenes. So I
yeah,
like to close the bedroom door. And I think the other thing really is I'm often asked to read writer friends' books, and it's nearly always the chaps who write the sex scenes, and you tend to look at them and think, oh, is that what you're into? Or or sometimes you think this is cringing, it's cringe making. And I did have a good writer friend who had written a most splendid book. It really was fabulous. The research was brilliant. His prose is wonderful. And in the middle of it all, he's used the word bum cheeks. And he said, what did you think of the book? And I said, please ditch the bum cheeks. It doesn't fit with the rest of the. And then you think that's obviously what he likes, is grabbing somebody's bum cheeks. And I thought, we really didn't need to know that. And I think the other thing is, when you're reading, I think the best sex is often what goes on in people's heads, what you imagine. And
yeah,
everybody will have a different idea of what the most exciting encounter might be. And if the one you're reading doesn't fulfill your expectations, you're not going to enjoy the book the same. So I always think, get the couple into the bedroom, close the door, and let the reader imagine what's going to happen.
yeah. Leave it to their
That for me is,
imagination.
yeah, I think so. So that's one thing I would, I would leave to the imagination,
Yeah.
definitely.
Sort of with your books, so you have there's a series, you've written them as a series, but they're sort of standalones within the series. would you
Absolutely.
would you ever like to sort of make the characters into a series? Is there any ones that you'd like to go back and revisit?
Well, it's funny you should say that, because I've been doing a bit of that this week, actually. With all the emphasis at the moment on cozy crime, I think from what people say, cozy crime is probably the number one subgenre of crime.
Yeah.
It really sells. I know when I'm in my local community library, lots of ladies my age and a bit older are elbowing me out of the way to get to the cozy crime books. So I can tell it's popular. And I thought maybe I should have a go at that. But then I thought, well, what would I do? And two things happened. One, I was researching a murder which happened not far from where I live 60 years ago, and it never got solved. And secondly, I started realizing that two of my characters, my regular characters in my espionage series,
Mm.
are not that far off retirement. And I started thinking, what would they do when they retire? They've had this exciting life. They've been,
Yeah.
chasing spies, doing all
Mm.
kinds of interesting work. And they suddenly find themselves in a small English country village. And apart from joining the U3A, there's not a lot going on. And so I started writing a bit about where they've turned up. They've sold their flat in London and bought this lovely house in a nice village, which is probably going to be somewhere near where I live. And obviously, Carol, the lady, she joins the U3A. It's the biggest show in town. And like me, she joins the family history unit, the little group. And
Yeah.
she hears somebody talking about this unsolved murder. And she goes home and she discusses it with Dave, her husband, who was he'd retired as a murder detective before he got taken on by MI5 as an agent handler, what they call an experienced hire. And he's still got all the contacts, so he arranges for her to go up and see the relevant police office to have a look at the old case files. And so the two of them get involved in investigating this murder. And obviously it's going to get dangerous and tricky. So
Yeah.
I thought, well, I'll give that a go. So that's a way of, because a few people have said, I think it was Mark Billingham was saying he'd given up writing about one of his characters because basically it just got too old. Not Mark, the actual character. And there comes a
Yeah.
point where you have to retire your heroes, don't you, your
Yeah.
protagonists. So I thought, well, that would be a nice way to morph then into cozy crime, take them into
I think there's
retirement.
definitely something in that, isn't there? Because you've got Richard Osman, who's his books set in the old people's home, and so it shows that there's definitely there's that definitely that core there's definitely a market for that sort of definitely cozy crime is huge. We speak to lots of authors who and people seem to really love it. I like it. I find it really enjoyable, and I like the unusual sleuths. I always find them fascinating. We've had a couple of panels when we've done unusual sleuths. So yeah, that sounds amazing. Did
Yeah,
you
I think
sorry.
I was just going to say, there's a lot of potential there, I think. I mean, even James Bond, I know he keeps remorphing and regenerating or
Yeah,
whatever, but,
young. Yeah.
but I mean, I think I would like to know what happened to James Bond when he retired. How did he cope with his arthritis? And did he have any STDs, after all these sexual
I
adventures?
expect so. Yeah.
But that wouldn't be very cozy. But no, I think there's so many interesting and quite enjoyable cozy crimes on there, and I think they've got certain. I don't really believe in rules that go with novels, but effectively with cozy crime, they don't really want you to see the murder happening. It's already happened, and it's the sort of
Yeah.
aftermath and how it gets
Yeah.
resolved. So that's quite good. You don't have to have blood and gore all over the carpet.
No. Sarah's saying she's here to read your new book. She wants to. Yeah, she's very excited about that one. Laura's asking, are there any true crime cases that you're thinking of exploring next?
Yes, in fact, I've just finished another book, which I'm sort of trying to work up the courage to send off for the True Crime Awards for next year. And it's about a man who was wrongly hanged for murder. It was a miscarriage of justice, but it happened in the neighbourhood where I grew up as a kid. I grew up in Manchester, and this was a murder that happened like a 5-minute walk from my home. And the man who was hanged, it's since been demonstrated he couldn't possibly have done it, but nobody looked into who actually did it. And so I found that quite a challenge. And I did an awful lot of research on that. I did already publish it under a different title, but I've decided to change it because I wanted the first book put more research into the victim and her family. But the new book is actually looking more at the detectives, the judges involved. There was corruption, there was withholding of evidence. The poor man was stitched up really badly. And I wanted to look more at the victim and the effect it had on families and ever since. But the main thing I wanted to do was solve the crime. And I've come up with a much more credible suspect who had an overwhelmingly strong reason for wanting the deceased woman to be murdered. And he could so easily have done it. He was a thoroughly unpleasant person. And so I've tried to sort of prove the case against him. So that's what I've been working on at the moment. And I'm creating it as a book to start with, and then hopefully find a publisher to take it on. But it's called The Wronged Man, not The Wrong Man, but The Wronged Man, a miscarriage of justice. So I hope that might interest people.
you're incredibly busy. You must be, what does your writing day look like? Have you got several things on the go at once?
I have actually. I've got about 4 or 5 different drafts because sometimes I get a bit bored with something or I can't decide where it's going next. So I'll put it to one side and go on to something else.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about the series of standalones with the same sort of
Mm.
characters in, but years ago I spent a month in France on a course, a law enforcement officers course, with of the many delegates on the course. One of them was an American FBI agent. And he was a fascinating guy. And when he'd had a few drinks, he used to tell us all about his operations and how he worked, how his department worked, what Pennsylvania Avenue was like, the whole lot. I kind of stored all that up. And so I've just finished a book, which is not in my current series. It's based in America, and it does involve this FBI agent that I've kind of made up. And it's sort of science-based. It's based on the abuse of DNA and how other foreign hostile governments are abusing DNA and what they could do to bring down the US government. So that's the story. And again, that's very different from what I've been doing. But you'll get an idea and you'll think it doesn't fit in with my series, but I'll just scribble a few bits and see if it
Yeah.
works. And you say that I'm very busy. Well, I do get up early in the morning. I'm usually awake by 5 because I just wake up and my head's buzzing. And so I have to get that first cup of Earl Grey and get the
Yeah.
keyboard out. And as you might see, if you could see more of my study, I don't do an awful lot of housework. My husband's the one who gets the vacuum cleaner out and he does most of the cooking. So he's quite happy to leave me alone and let me get on with it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I do. I spend probably an undue amount of time actually writing or planning or plotting or what have you.
Yeah, no, I mean, definitely, it sounds like you're a very busy lady with, you've just got so much going on. And yeah, I think sort of, when was your first book published? Have you been published for several years now?
Well, I started off self-publishing because I never thought of myself as a control freak, but when I heard a few stories about some of my writer chums who'd had really, really bad experiences, one chap in particular who the publisher who took his book on really messed it up, and he messed it up in such a bad way. And it was written on quite a sensitive subject, and it was his one story. It was based on the most exciting time of his life. He was involved in a major sort of war overseas, and he was only going to write this one book, and it meant a lot to him. And it was so badly dealt with by the publisher that my friend ended up getting death threats. And
Oh,
so
goodness.
that kind of, I sort of decided really, if you self-publish, you're going to have total control. You can decide what your cover is going to
Yeah.
look like. You can
Yeah.
go and get a good cover designer. You can decide what font you want it in and everything. And so I did
Yeah,
that for the
absolutely.
first few. I think 2012, I think was my first one. And then recently, it was actually when I wrote The Kohat Connection, and my publisher, it's Spellbound Books of Hertfordshire, and it's an independent publisher. And one of the ladies running it, she's of British Pakistani origin. So when I said I'd got a book about Pakistan, she said, "We'll have it." So she was very good. She gave
Oh,
it a quick
wow.
read and said, "Yeah, that's for us," because she said people don't write anything set in Pakistan, and so she was very
No.
pleased. And she and the editor really loved it, and so then they asked for my next one. And they've also very kindly offered to publish some of my backlist, and that'll be as a box set. So everything will have the same. I mean, Nikki East does my covers, and they're just beautiful. I
Yeah.
think what she does.
Yeah, they are
So,
really gorgeous. Yeah.
and I think hopefully the whole set will look in a similar vein. So yeah, it feels it's a very different experience when I get twitchy. I think I should be doing this and I should be doing that, but then the publisher's doing it all. It's
Well,
quite
that's the
odd.
thing, isn't it? Yeah. And I think, obviously, getting the books out there and obviously people being able to sort of discover you and also that you've got a nice little back catalogue. People quite often like that, don't they, as well, to move forward. So is there any going to be any more in the espionage series? Is that something that you're looking at, or are you sort of parking that for the moment?
No, actually, I've got 2 more quite well advanced, actually. One's set in Cornwall. It's still got some of the same MI5 team, and that's called Death of a Silver Darling. And it involves a very handsome professional man who suddenly turns up in a nice Cornish fishing village and unfortunately seems to have committed suicide. He's taken his sports car over a cliff. But then the local DI, Barney Trelawn, starts to think it's beginning to look like a murder. And then suddenly MI5 get involved. And the main thing is they can't find out who this man really was because he doesn't seem to have existed before he pitched up in Cornwall. And then a very serious situation breaks out where MI5 are on the hunt. There was a big race against time to find 3 dirty bombs which have been planted somewhere in the UK. So you've got these two things which apparently are unconnected, but probably will end up being connected. And I've also got another one called The Hunter's Moon Killings, which is again set in the UK in various nice rural locations. Oxfordshire, Buckinghamshire, Yorkshire, all over the place. But it's during that week of the autumn full moon, or as it's known, the hunter's moon, where somebody's going around killing groups of people. At the same time, you've got groups of Russian intelligence officers appearing in the UK and they're rambling around at large, and MI5 are trying to track their activities. And there's one or two other things going on. An MI6 man who unfortunately has got early onset dementia, has had to be medically retired, and he's gone missing. So people are looking for him as well in case he's actually been abducted because of what he knows. Yeah. So all of these events, are they linked? Are they not linked? So that's the next couple of things I'm working on in that series.
Yeah, but yeah, you have got a lot on. A lot.
Well, I think some people will concentrate on one book at a time. And that kind of bores me a bit. I think, no, if another idea pops up, I think, push that to one side. Let's just see how this works, And
yeah, definitely.
I don't know if you remember that awful character Gus in Drop the Dead Donkey, where he used to say, "Let's drop this in the fish tank and see if it blows bubbles." And, those kind of little platitudes I like to think. Let's see if I can get bubbles out of this story.
Oh, thank you so much, Denise. It's been an absolutely fascinating hour. I mean, you make me feel very lazy when I hear what you're up to. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I'll post the links to your books in the chat as well.
Thank you.
And we'll also, this one and all of our videos are recorded and we put them on YouTube. So if you want to share them and anybody else, if they want to catch up, then you can. So I think Kaz and Sam are back this week with interviews. I think we've got interviews most days this week. So yes, look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you, Denise. Good luck with all the books that you've got coming next.
Thank you, Karen.
Please come on and chat to us again.
I'd love to. Thanks for having me. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.